Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're diving into a period that, I'm not kidding, completely invented the way we consume stories right now. We're talking about the 18th century. And this wasn't just a small change. It was a full-blown literary Big Bang that created the entire universe of books, media, and storytelling that we're all still living in.
Okay, so to really get this, let's look at the before and after. Before this explosion, stories were all about poetry and passion. Think huge, dramatic epics, kings and gods and massive emotions. But the 18th century just flipped that on its head. Suddenly, the new rock stars were prose and reason. The whole game shifted from these grand, epic feelings to clear, logical thinking and, well, just telling it like it is.
So, here's how we're going to trace this whole explosion. First, we'll look at the Age of Reason, which kind of set the initial conditions. Then, we'll see how a brand new public sphere acted like a superhighway for ideas. We'll get to the main event, the birth of the novel. After that, how wit became a weapon, how new voices and even darker stories emerged, and finally, we'll connect all those dots right back to our world today. So, what was the world actually like right before this Big Bang? Well, it was called the Age of Reason. And on the surface, it all looked pretty sophisticated, It was all about sharp intellect, perfect manners, and sparkling conversation. But if you look just a little bit closer, yeah, there was something else going on. Yeah, one historian, Gerhard Lohmer, doesn't mince words here at all. He basically argues that for all its polish, this was a deeply cynical time. The big, passionate ideals were gone, and in their place was this kind of clever but ultimately destructive wit. It was an age of high society and social games, sure, but at its heart, a lot of people felt it was kind of hollow.
But that quiet, cynical world was about to get completely shattered. A new kind of space for public discussion was popping up, and you can honestly think of it as the 18th century version of the internet. It was this brand new place where ideas could suddenly be shared, argued about, and spread like you wouldn't believe.
So what were the catalysts for this new internet? Two huge things. First, you have the printing press becoming way more common, which is like information suddenly becoming available to everyone. And second, coffee houses. These places weren't just for getting a caffeine fix. They were the physical servers of this new network. They were the real-world forums where people got together to debate everything they were reading.
And what's amazing is how organized this whole thing was. Check out this quote. Magazines like The Tatler were basically acting like moderators, setting up different channels for every topic. It's like saying, okay, if you want to talk about poetry, you go to this coffee house. For academic stuff, you go to that one. It was a whole system.
All right, let's get to the main event of this literary Big Bang, the invention of a totally revolutionary piece of storytelling technology. And if the coffee house was the internet, then the novel was the invention of the selfie. It was the first time that ordinary people could see themselves, their regular, complicated, real lives reflected back in a piece of art.
And the name really says it all, doesn't it? Nouvelle. It just means new. This wasn't a minor update. It was a complete system reboot, a very deliberate break from that old world of epic poems and stories about far-off aristocrats.
Now, the novel didn't just appear out of thin air. It was this perfect storm of conditions that made it possible. You had this growing middle class that could not only read, but could also afford to buy books. The old-school theaters were kind of losing their cool. And probably most importantly, people were getting tired of stories about gods and heroes. They wanted realism. They were hungry for stories that felt like their own lives.
I mean, for centuries, the main characters in literature were totally unrelatable for the average person. They were kings, queens, legendary knights, maybe a few gods. Their problems were, how do I save my kingdom, or how do I slay this monster? Not exactly the stuff of everyday life.
And this right here, this is the seismic shift. The novel put ordinary people right at the center of the story. All of a sudden, the heroes were merchants, servants, regular citizens. And their struggles were about things like social status, money, morality, and just surviving in the world as it actually was. Literature stopped being just a window into some fantasy land, and it became a mirror. So this new world of prose and logic didn't just lead to new kinds of stories. It also handed writers an incredibly powerful new weapon to criticize the world around them. That weapon was satire. And they used it to expose all the hypocrisy and corruption that was hiding just beneath society's very polished surface. And you can basically boil down 18th century satire into two main flavors. On one hand, you've got Horatian satire. Think of this like a friendly roast. It's witty, it's gentle, and it pokes fun at people's flaws to try and make them better. And then you have Juvenalian satire. This is no friendly roast. This is a brutal, savage takedown that attacks what it sees as moral corruption with pure, unadulterated outrage. And if you want an example of just how brutal Juvenalian satire could be, look no further than this absolutely infamous line from Jonathan Swift. He wasn't just criticizing British policy towards the poor in Ireland, he presented this horrifying, shocking solution to expose the complete inhumanity of the situation with a kind of savage force that you can never, ever forget. So, just like the real Big Bang, this literary universe kept on expanding. The doors to the world of writing were thrown open, and new voices and totally new kinds of stories started to pour in. It wasn't just an exclusive boys' club anymore, and the kinds of stories getting told started to get a whole lot more diverse, and sometimes a whole lot darker.
And a massive part of this expansion was that women began to take the literary stage in a huge way. Building on the work of pioneers like Aphra Behn from the century before, you started to see writers like Fanny Burney in England and Sophie von La Roche in Germany become major literary figures. It wasn't an even process everywhere, but the trend was unmistakable. Women weren't just readers anymore, they were actively shaping the entire conversation.
But with all this focus on logic, order, and reason, a question started to bubble up from the subconscious. What about all the things that reason can't explain? What about fear? What about superstition? And all the darkness that lurks in the shadows of our minds?
Well, the answer to that question is, you get the Gothic novel. And honestly, the best way to think about it is as the Enlightenment's dark mode. Gothic writers weren't trying to throw reason out the window. They were exploring irrationality and terror to actually highlight just how important reason and order are by showing the terrifying things that happen when they're gone.
Okay, so why does any of this 18th century history matter to us, right here, right now? It's simple. We are still living in the universe that this explosion created. The light from that literary Big Bang is still reaching us, and it's shaping the very way we think, communicate, and tell stories today.
Seriously, think about it. The very concept of public opinion having any power, that was born in those coffee houses. The whole market for mass-produced books, journalism that mixes news with opinion, and, this is the big one, our fundamental expectation that stories should be about normal, relatable people, the DNA of all of those things traces directly back to this one revolutionary period.
And that leaves us with one final thought to take away. The 18th century had a media revolution that changed everything. The novel. It literally reshaped how society saw itself. So here we are, a couple of centuries later, in our own age of massive technological and media change. It really makes you wonder, what's our novel? What's the revolutionary new form of storytelling that's redefining our world right now?